Hi, everyone. I'm so glad to be with you today at the We Give Summit. My name is Radha Friedman, and I am a fundraiser turned grant maker turned philanthropic advisor on a mission to encourage more charitable giving and investments in the people who have historically received the least resources, especially women and girls of color who receive less than 1% of philanthropic dollars. I have been devoted to this issue for over 2 decades, working across 5 continents and over 60 countries, from some of the biggest foundations in the world to some of the smallest and scrappiest nonprofits you've probably never heard of. And today I want to talk with you about a topic very near and dear to my heart: fundraising without burnout. Super uplifting, right? The thing is, today burnout rates are at an all-time high. Right now, about 80% of employees are reporting feeling emotionally drained, and 1 in 4 are reporting severe burnout. And I know burnout is widespread. We've all been watching the headlines as the great resignation has unfolded. But I think it's really important to talk about how this is manifesting in the nonprofit sector, where nonprofits have been undertaking heroic work to protect the fundamental rights of our communities. And with the turbulence of the COVID pandemic these last few years, not to mention wars and climate crises and attacks on human rights almost every day, nonprofits have really had to take a bigger share of responsibility for taking care of our communities. And within nonprofits, burnout is highest among those who are seeking the funding to continue doing this work, because they are the ones that have to repeat heartbreaking stories over and over again in order to convince donors to keep investing in this work, only to be met with compassion fatigue. And as a result, a lot of development directors today are not just getting frustrated by this and quitting, they are dropping out of the nonprofit sector altogether. And that poses a very big challenge for us, because we cannot protect the fundamental rights of our communities without resources. And we need fundraisers to find those resources and steward the relationships and the partnerships that ensure their sustainability. So a few years ago, the Haas Junior Fund and Compass Point decided to undertake some research to find out why development and development roles in particular were such a challenge for nonprofits. They surveyed thousands of development directors and executive directors, and the report summarized their findings. It's called Underdeveloped, and basically pointed to 3 key findings. First, they found that the development director position inside nonprofits had basically become a revolving door with really high turnover and vacancies lasting 6 months on average. Second, they found that nonprofit leaders were struggling to find qualified candidates. A lot of them were reporting that the applicants didn't actually have the skills to do the job. I would posit this actually means expectations were unrealistic. And third, they found that there was a lack of support for fundraising itself. By that, I mean a development director would walk into a new job only to discover there's no fundraising database, no records, no fundraising plan, and no fundraising support or help from the board. As a result, 50% of the development directors that they talked with in this survey reported that they were frustrated, exhausted, and planning to quit. 50%. That's half of our development workforce right there. Now, add to that the effects of the COVID pandemic, and you see the challenge. One of the most significant things we saw during COVID were disproportionate effects for different people based on social determinants, right? Race, gender, disability, LGBTQ identity, etc. And any person who was standing at the intersection of those identities felt a magnified impact. And in particular, the gendered effects of this are particularly significant when we're talking about burnout, because our sector is powered by a majority of women, mostly white women. And what we experienced during these last few years of COVID was referred to by so many people as a she session, because so many women ended up getting forced out of the workforce. Of course, this is because women were expected to care for the children when the schools were closed, and care for their families, and carry all the invisible household labor, and continue to work their full-time jobs, and something had to give. In 1 month alone, US economic reports showed that 100% of the jobs lost were from women. 100%. And in our fundraising and development roles, we have even more of this disproportionate gender effect, because 80% of development staff identify as women. But when it comes to executive leadership roles, such as your chief development officer, Suddenly, that number flips. 80% of the highest paid executive development roles are held by men. Why does this inequity matter when we're talking about burnout? First of all, we need to be aware of what causes people to burn out. For example, if they feel like they don't see anyone in a higher position that looks like them and they're never going to advance in their careers, that can lead you to say, why bother and quit. Second, we need to understand that burnout affects people differently based on gender. Typically, men report that when they start to feel burned out, they begin to get disconnected from their work, whereas women start to report anxiety, self doubt, imposter syndrome, etc. And third, we need to pay attention to how our workplaces and our philanthropic sector overall is contributing to this, including centering the needs of our donors rather than our communities that we serve and asking fundraisers to jump through a lot of unnecessary hoops. We cannot pin all of our hopes and dreams on one position in our organization, especially when we know that this position has such high turnover, and then be surprised when they collapse under the weight of the world on their shoulders. And we cannot hire our way out of this because the cycle is just going to repeat with the next development director. So if you take away nothing else from this session, I want you to feel seen. And I want you to know you are not broken if you're struggling with fundraising for your work. The system is broken. The reason you're exhausted and burned out is because you're working inside oppressive systems, patriarchy and white supremacy and capitalism, where perfectionism and hustle culture have made you believe that somehow your worth and value is proportionate to the amount of money you can raise for your organization. And oppressive systems are designed that way to make it so difficult to change the status quo that eventually you just become so exhausted that you give up. And we cannot give up. If you're nodding along to any of this, maybe this sounds familiar to you. You joined a nonprofit because you totally fell in love with its mission. You love the optimism of believing that a better world is possible and knowing that you can be part of the change. But somewhere along the way, you realized, oh, now you are responsible for whether the organization thrives or suffers, regardless of whether you have any support. Best case scenario, you succeed and you raise the funds that you need for this year's organization. Now that mountaintop you just scaled to get that funding just becomes your new benchmark. Anything less than that is no longer good enough now. Next year, you have to climb an even bigger mountain. And if you don't succeed, for whatever reason, if a donor decides to do a strategy refresh or completely changes their focus or makes a big pledge and then ghosts you, you are the one responsible for the fallout. And the stakes are very high because fundraising roles are very visible and public facing. You often use your own social capital and call on people that you know from other parts of your life to fill tables at your events. You put your own friendships on the line. So it's no wonder that so many fundraisers burn out and leave their jobs after an average of 18 months. I know what scaling this fundraising mountain feels like because many years ago, all my fundraising dreams came true. I helped an organization bring in more money than they had ever seen before. I joined a small, humble nonprofit that was fighting for land rights for the world's poorest families. And in less than 2 years, we quadrupled our budget with multiple multi-million dollar grants. We opened new offices. We earned some of the world's most prestigious awards, like the Hilton Humanitarian Prize and the Skoll Award for Social Entrepreneurship. But instead of feeling like I was on top of the world, it was the most miserable I had ever been in my life. We took that fundraising leap because we changed who we were centering in our stories, and we began focusing on those who were invisible. Women, predominantly women of color who were living in rural areas in extreme poverty and with fewer rights. And once we did that, we began attracting new partners who opened new doors for us. And once we were able to get in front of new donors and tell our story, we just started to make it rain. But the funding came in so fast. I wasn't even sure I was in the same nonprofit anymore because our entire culture changed dramatically and quickly. Suddenly, there was hierarchy everywhere, closed doors that were once open, fights over budgets, and my humble little nonprofit felt like a war zone. And I felt responsible. I looked around and thought to myself, if this is what successful fundraising looks like, I don't want any part of it. I had done everything right, everything I was told to do. We had not only met, but surpassed all of our fundraising goals. And yet I was so burned out and disillusioned by all of this fundraising success. I wasn't even sure if I should stay in the nonprofit sector anymore. Honestly, I was ready to leave the country, just start a new life, maybe get bangs. And so I pivoted. I took a job as a grant maker. So now I would get to sit on the other side of the table, giving the funding to nonprofits. And let me tell you, it turned out to be a hugely eye opening experience. And having a seat at the grant making table helped me understand why fundraising had led me to exhaustion and burnout. As a grant maker, I saw all of these incredibly inspiring and just badass proposals that I really wanted to fund, but they were constantly being passed over by the other members of the grant making committee who considered them too risky. While so many proposals that I thought were just boring and status quo were favored by the other decision makers, who I described as male, pale, and from Yale, simply because they thought that the project's leader reminded them of themselves when they were younger. And it helped me understand why the causes I cared so much about, like investing in women and girls of color, receive less than 1% of philanthropic dollars. All these years, what I had been interpreting as my failure to get more funds to these issues was, in fact, a failure of our systems, which have historically just passed wealth to the same people over and over. And this is also part of what causes good fundraisers to burn out. So let's just zoom out for 1 minute. How are we defining burnout and what is driving all of this? So, Dr. Masloch is the researcher who coined the term, and she described burnout as an erosion of the human soul. It's become prevalent enough that the World Health Organization now classifies burnout in its international classification of diseases, describing it as a syndrome resulting in chronic workplace stress that has not been successfully managed. It's typically characterized by three dimensions: feeling exhausted, feeling negative about your job, and feeling a lack of accomplishment. So raise your hand if you felt any of those. But I think the World Health Organization definition is really important because it acknowledges burnout is not an employee problem. It's a systemic and sectoral problem, which means that's the kind of solution it needs. So, what's causing all of this, and where are our responses falling short? For the sake of time, I'm going to simplify this into three themes. The first is we are blaming individuals rather than systems. We're treating this as a you problem. You just need better work life balance. You just need to take a yoga class. You just need to take a vacation. You just need to lean in, girl. But there's no analysis of the cultures that we're operating in. So many of our nonprofits operate with a scarcity mindset, and the expectation is that employees will overwork regardless of compensation. And that just leads to toxic productivity and exhaustion. The second thing is we don't give fundraisers enough support, and yet our expectations of fundraisers are crazy high. One of the biggest reasons for burnout among development professionals are these kinds of expectations. And when there's a lack of investment in fundraising systems or software or an unengaged board, we're just not setting them up for success. The third is we're not talking about this as a sector, including with our donors who have a huge role to play in how philanthropy works. It's so difficult, I know, because of the power dynamics to have these honest conversations about the real cost of what it takes to do this work. But imagine asking donors for budget lines for the mental health of the staff. Imagine asking for unrestricted multi-year giving without all of the stress of copious reporting. Imagine asking funders for sabbaticals. Right now, funders are often unintentionally causing extra stress and harm to nonprofits that they want to help. And nonprofits are too afraid of losing funding to talk with their donors about the toll the work is taking on the staff, and how affirming and healing it would be if there was a cushion of funding to have the rest they needed to recharge themselves. The good news is burnout is recognizable, preventable, treatable, and totally reversible. You can recover from this when you start to see the early warning signs. However, if you ignore it, you just try to muscle through it, and you hit severe burnout, it can take 2 to 5 years to recover. So it's in all of our best interest to act now. Instead of blaming our employees for burning out, we can acknowledge this is a systemic issue throughout our sector. We can help by creating healthy work cultures, like adopting a 4-day work week, giving employees sabbaticals, providing flexible leave policies. Most importantly, we can create some space for open conversations and honest conversations about realistic expectations. Second, instead of putting all the responsibility on one person and expecting that job, that role to solve all of the organization's problems and then wondering why they're burning out, we can build stronger cultures of philanthropy to support them. Fundraising is a team sport. We can come together as giving circles, as board members, as true partners and support them. And third, instead of shying away from these honest conversations, we should talk with donors about the true costs of the work. Today, so many nonprofits and donors are in separate rooms having conversations about the exact same issues. And that's really inhibiting critical conversations about how we can work together to solve our common challenges. We need to remember that our suffering and thriving is mutual. We've been convinced for so long that we just don't have the power to change things, but I believe we do have the power to transform broken systems into much more equitable ones. I truly believe we are the ones we've been waiting for. Thank you so much. If you're interested in learning more, you can visit my website, fundraisingwithoutburnout.com.